Hello, my name is David Grand. It's a pleasure for me to speak with you today. I'm actually speaking from New York City. I'm a therapist here and I have a practice in Manhattan, but I'm also the developer of Brainspotting, which is a brain-body-based, mindfulness-based, relational-based psychotherapy. And I'd like to just talk a little bit or share some of my thoughts about trauma and how trauma is both a part of life and it's also a physiological or physical condition, even though we see it as a psychological condition. Everybody experiences trauma in life, and the most profound traumas are the ones that we experience in the first few years of our life, which everybody has, because, you know, birth actually is a trauma. We have the term birth trauma, and nothing goes the way that we want it to go or need it to go all the time. And there are unexpected things that come up. And some of us are actually raised in more adverse conditions than others. And this is what we call early trauma or pre-verbal trauma. And as it goes on through childhood, we call it developmental trauma. So going back to what I was saying, trauma is a part of life. Some people experience more traumas in childhood. And of course, trauma goes on throughout life. We have negative experiences, car accidents, losses, sometimes we fall down in the street, or we can be attacked. Anything like this can constitute a trauma. But what happens is when we have an adult trauma, the adult trauma sits on top of the traumas that we've had in childhood. So when people come to me and other trauma therapists for brain spotting and other therapies, usually we'll find that to address adult traumas, we end up addressing childhood traumas which underlie the adult traumas. So the second part of what I want to say is how trauma is physiological, or in other words, it's in the brain. What happens when we have a traumatic experience is that the brain gets overwhelmed. The brain is a fantastic processing machine with over 1 to 4 quadrillion synaptic connections. And the reason the brain is so complex, really infinitely complex, is so that it can process everything that we experience in the moment, from the past, anticipating the future, inside in our bodies and outside all around us, and interactions with other people. But when we get traumatized, the brain gets overwhelmed, and its capacity to process the trauma breaks down. And accordingly, pieces of the traumatic experience are left unprocessed in the brain, but it's left unprocessed in the parts of the brain we call the subcortex, below the neocortex, where there is no language, no thought, just emotion, body sensation, intuition, so that in that sense, the traumas are below the level of thought and language. So you need therapies that address that can address these kind of traumas. But in this context, trauma is eminently healable. In the past, before we had these techniques, trauma was oftentimes seen as something that a person would have to carry for the rest of their lives. But now with the more brain-based, mindfulness-based, body-based, and relational-based therapies all together, we're actually able to help people to process in the present the traumas that they're still carrying from the past unprocessed in their deeper parts of the brain. And sometimes for more simple traumas, it can happen more quickly in 3 to 5 to 10 sessions. But if it's really a person who's had significant childhood trauma, especially in the early years of their life, it may take longer, sometimes significantly longer, but it can heal. So that's really the message. So just sort of to summarize what I've said, trauma is a part of life. Trauma starts in the beginning of life. It goes throughout life. Trauma is physiological. It's in the deeper parts of the brain. But trauma is healable as well, which is wonderful news for all of us and for all humans on this planet. And I just want to say it's been a pleasure for me to contribute to this White January. And I hope you have found what I've said to be informative.